It was a quiet Tuesday morning at Mike's gas station, a small, worn-down place on the corner of Route 9. Nothing fancy, nothing new. Just one of those gas stations you pass by every day without a second thought. It was the kind of place where the coffee sat on a burner for hours, the same few snacks filled the shelves, and the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to echo through the still air. The smell of gasoline, stale pastries, and cheap cleaning products lingered constantly, like it was part of the building itself. Most customers didn't stay long, grab a coffee, buy a lottery ticket, or fill up their tank and leave. It wasn't the type of place where things happened. It was quiet, forgettable, and, for the most part, safe. Behind the counter sat John Wallace, the man everyone knew but no one really noticed. He looked like he belonged there, behind the register, surrounded by rows of gum and cigarette displays. He was gray-bearded, with strong, weathered hands and the slow, deliberate movements of someone who'd lived long enough not to rush anymore. His faded flannel shirt and plain jeans didn't draw attention, and his expression rarely changed, calm, steady, maybe even a little bored. To strangers, John was nothing more than the old guy at the counter. But John Wallace wasn't always the old guy. A long time ago, in a different life, John had worn a badge. He'd spent 30 years as a police officer walking beats, chasing down criminals, and staring danger right in the face. He'd seen things most people couldn't imagine and done things he didn't care to talk about. His hands, steady as they were now, had once pulled people out of burning cars and held guns pointed at the worst kind of men. When he retired 5 years ago, John thought he'd had enough excitement to last him a lifetime. All he wanted now was peace. So, he took the job at Mike's, mostly to keep busy. It wasn't much, but it gave him a small paycheck and something to do with his time. No one asked questions about his past, and John didn't offer answers. That's how he liked it. On this particular Tuesday morning, everything was normal. John sat on his stool behind the counter, reading yesterday's newspaper. The faint ding of the gas pump outside marked the occasional customer, but otherwise, it was quiet. Peaceful. And then, the glass door swung open. The sound wasn't the usual soft chime of someone walking in. It was louder. Sharper. The clang of the door crashing against the metal frame broke the quiet like a fist through a window. John didn't look up right away. Years of experience had taught him not to overreact. But then he heard them. The sound of heavy boots stomping across the tiled floor. The low mutter of voices. The scrape of leather. 3 men walked in, and the energy of the gas station changed immediately. They were bikers, and not the friendly kind. Their leather jackets were scuffed and torn, with patches stitched on like trophies from battles won. Their tattoos, thick black ink that snaked up their arms and around their necks, spoke of violence and secrets that didn't belong to quiet little places like this one. They were big, too. Muscular. The kind of guys you wouldn't want to bump into in a dark alley or even in broad daylight. To everyone else, these men might as well have owned the place. They carried themselves like kings of the road, heads high, chests puffed out. Their boots thudded on the floor as they spread out slightly, each man eyeing the gas station like it was theirs to take. John glanced up, just for a moment. He took in the scene with the calm, unflinching stare of someone who'd seen men like this before. He didn't need to look long to know what kind of trouble they were. They were the kind of men who enjoyed making people nervous. The kind who liked to take control of every room they walked into, even if no one asked for it. The leader of the group stepped forward first. He was the biggest of the 3, broad-shouldered with a shaved head and a scar that ran down his left cheek. It cut through his face like a jagged line, making his scowl look even nastier. Behind him, the other 2 followed closely. One was shorter but stocky, his arms covered in swirling tattoos. The third was wiry and sharp-faced, with dark eyes that darted around the room like a predator searching for prey. The leader, Scarface, swaggered up to the counter where John sat. He leaned against it, his thick arms resting lazily on the surface. "Hey, Pops," he said, his voice a mix of arrogance and amusement. The words hung in the air, sharp and condescending. John looked up slowly, his face unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't frown. He just looked. Calm. Steady. "Mind telling us where the cold drinks are?" Scarface continued. His tone was mocking, his smile full of teeth. "Or do we need to help ourselves?" For a long second, there was silence. A few other customers stood in the aisles, suddenly frozen in place. They were pretending not to hear, but everyone felt it, the tension in the room. The bikers weren't just asking for drinks. They were testing. Testing John. Testing everyone. Seeing what they could get away with. John didn't react the way they expected. He didn't stammer. He didn't look scared. He just blinked once, slowly, and answered in his usual quiet voice. "Aisle 3, he said simply. Then he turned his attention back to the newspaper, as if the conversation was already over. Scarface stared at him, waiting for more, an apology, maybe, or a sign of fear. He got neither. The biker's smirk faltered for half a second before he chuckled under his breath. "Aisle 3, huh? You're a helpful guy, Pops." The other bikers laughed, their voices low and cruel. Scarface pushed himself off the counter, his boots thudding against the tile as he turned. "Let's see what kind of drinks they've got here, boys." They walked deeper into the store, their presence filling the small space like smoke. They didn't move quickly or quietly. They didn't care that the other customers were watching them nervously from behind shelves of snacks and canned soup. To the bikers, this was their gas station now. Behind the counter, John didn't look up. He didn't need to. His calm demeanor hadn't changed, but something about the way he turned the page of his newspaper seemed just a little sharper. To the bikers, this was a game. To John Wallace, it was something else entirely. In the back of the store, the bikers began pulling drinks out of the refrigerators. Bottles clinked together as they grabbed more than they could carry, laughing as they went. One of them shoved a display of chips off the shelf just for fun. Bags tumbled to the floor, their bright colors standing out against the dirty tiles. "Oops," the stocky one snickered. "Guess that shelf wasn't sturdy." Scarface wandered toward the candy aisle, picking up a chocolate bar, turning it over, and tossing it back carelessly. It hit the floor and slid across the aisle. "Not much of a selection in this dump," he muttered loudly. The sound of their boots. The laughter. The clinking of glass bottles. It filled the quiet of the gas station, making every customer hold their breath just a little tighter. But John? John stayed perfectly still behind the counter. He didn't look at the bikers, but he could hear everything they were doing. Years of training taught him to listen, really listen to every sound, every movement. He knew trouble when he heard it, and he knew men like this. They were looking for a fight. Scarface grabbed a handful of drinks and began walking back toward the front. His eyes lingered on the customers who pretended not to see him. He enjoyed the way they avoided his gaze, the way they shrank just a little when he walked past. As he approached the counter again, he dropped the bottles down with a loud thud. The glass rattled against the surface, but none of them broke. "You don't mind if these are on the house, right, Pops?" Scarface asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up from his newspaper, his eyes meeting Scarface's for the first time. Calm. Steady. Unshaken. "No free drinks today," John said plainly. For the first time, the leader's smile disappeared. For the first time, Scarface's smile disappeared. Just a flicker. It was brief, but John saw it. The way the corners of the biker's mouth twitched down. The way his eyes narrowed just a little. Scarface wasn't used to people saying no to him, especially not an old man behind a counter. "No free drinks today," Scarface repeated slowly, his voice dropping a notch. He leaned over the counter again, his massive arms folding in front of him as his scarred face loomed closer. John didn't flinch. "That's right," he said simply, his tone firm but calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry. He didn't look scared. He was just stating a fact like it was the weather outside or the price of gas. Scarface let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're kidding me, right? Look at you," he said, waving a hand toward John's flannel shirt and old jeans. "You don't own this place, Pops. So what's it to you if we take a couple of drinks?" John's eyes didn't leave Scarface's. "Store policy," he replied. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The two other bikers snickered behind Scarface, clearly enjoying the show. The wiry one with darting eyes stepped closer, pretending to inspect the bottles of soda and beer they had collected. "Kman, Scar, maybe the old man's just confused," he said in a thin, mocking voice. "He probably doesn't know who we are." Scarface grinned at that. His smile returned, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was the kind of grin that promised trouble. "That's it, isn't it, Pops?" he said. "You don't know who you're talking to." John didn't answer. He just stared back at the man, unblinking. He'd seen this kind of act 100 times before. He knew exactly what Scarface was trying to do: push him, intimidate him, and see if he would crack. But John Wallace wasn't the cracking type. Scarface's grin widened when John stayed silent. "Yeah, that's what I thought," he said, standing up straighter and looking back at his buddies. "Old man doesn't have a clue." The shorter, stockier biker laughed loudly. "We should teach him, then. Let him know who he's dealing with." The wiry one added, "Maybe he's just slow, you know. Maybe we should explain things real clear for him." Scarface turned back to John, his dark eyes locking onto him like a predator sizing up its prey. "How about this, Pops?" he said, his voice quiet but full of menace. "We take these drinks, and you mind your own business. That way, no one gets hurt." For the briefest second, the gas station felt like it was holding its breath. John looked at Scarface for a long moment. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No." The smile disappeared again. This time, it didn't come back. Scarface's face hardened, his scarred cheek twisting as he scowled. His buddies stopped laughing. The room went quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator units and the distant clinking of a gas pump outside. "No," Scarface repeated coldly. "You don't get to say no to me, old man." "I just did," John said evenly. Scarface slammed his hand on the counter, the sound cracking through the gas station like a gunshot. Several customers nearby flinched, their heads snapping up before they quickly looked away again. Nobody wanted to be a part of this. Nobody wanted to get involved. But John didn't so much as blink. "You've got guts, Pops, I'll give you that," Scarface growled. His face was inches from John's now, the anger in his voice just barely controlled. "But you're starting to push my patience." John met his gaze, his voice steady as ever. "You're starting to push mine." The short biker barked out a laugh. "Oh, man. This guy's got a death wish." Scarface didn't laugh this time. His fists curled on the counter, knuckles white. He was losing his temper, and everyone in the room could feel it. Behind him, his two friends moved restlessly, shifting their weight from foot to foot, looking like dogs ready to pounce. The wiry one grinned, already enjoying the way this was turning out. The stocky one cracked his knuckles loudly, like he was just waiting for Scarface to give the word. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like you could slice it with a knife. The few customers still in the gas station were frozen, too scared to leave and too afraid to look. A woman near the snack aisle held her purse close, her eyes darting toward the door as if she was calculating how quickly she could get outside. A man near the back pretended to read a magazine, his hands shaking just slightly. John noticed all of this without even turning his head. Years of experience had taught him to be aware of his surroundings at all times. He could hear every movement, every breath. He knew how scared the other customers were, how badly they wanted someone to do something. But John also knew something else: Scarface and his crew weren't used to being told no. They were the kind of men who bullied their way through life, taking whatever they wanted just because they could. They thought strength came from being louder, tougher, and meaner than everyone else. They thought fear was power. John had seen men like this before, back when he wore a badge. And he'd learned something important about them: bullies only have power if you give it to them. Scarface leaned even closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Listen, old man, you're gonna give us these drinks for free. You're gonna let us walk out that door. And you're not gonna say another word about it? You got that?" For the first time, John's calm expression shifted just slightly. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something far colder. He set his newspaper down carefully, folding it in half and placing it on the counter. Then, he looked up at Scarface, his eyes sharper now, clearer. For the first time, the room felt different. It was almost like the air itself had shifted. "I'm going to say this one more time," John said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "You're not getting anything for free." Scarface blinked, thrown off for just a second. The wiry biker let out a nervous laugh, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Is this guy serious?" Scarface's face darkened. "You've got no idea who you're messing with, Pops." John tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked on Scarface. "No," he said slowly. "You don't." The words hit like a hammer. The bikers didn't know it yet, but the game had just changed. Scarface stared at John, and for the first time, he looked unsure. It was just for a moment, but it was there, the faintest flicker of doubt in his dark eyes. He didn't know why, but something about the old man felt off. Scarface was used to people folding. He was used to people getting scared, apologizing, and giving him whatever he wanted just to make him go away. But John wasn't folding. John wasn't scared. And Scarface didn't like it. The stocky biker, impatient now, stepped forward, his boots clomping loudly against the tile. "What are we waiting for, Scar? Let's just take the drinks and go. This old man isn't gonna stop us." Scarface hesitated, but then his scowl returned. "Yeah," he said, his voice cold. "You're right." He reached for the bottles on the counter, his movements sharp and aggressive, like he was daring John to stop him. John didn't move. Not yet. He just watched. Scarface grabbed one of the bottles and started to turn toward the door, but just as he did, John spoke again. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Scarface froze mid-step. The words weren't loud. They weren't a shout or a command. They were quiet, calm. But there was something about the way John said them that made Scarface stop dead in his tracks. He turned back slowly, glaring at John. "What did you just say?" John didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He just looked Scarface right in the eye and said it again. "I said I wouldn't do that if I were you." For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. And then Scarface laughed, a short, ugly sound. He didn't know why, but his laugh sounded forced, like he was trying to convince himself that John wasn't worth worrying about. "You're a stubborn old man, aren't you?" Scarface sneered, pointing the bottle at John. "Maybe you're not as smart as you look." John's gaze didn't waver. "Or maybe I'm smarter than you think." The room fell silent again. Scarface's buddies shifted nervously behind him, waiting to see what their leader would do. The stocky one muttered, "Come on, man, let's just go. This isn't worth it." The scene stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. Scarface stood tall, his scarred face twisted into a cruel grin, like he was enjoying every second of this little display. His two buddies moved in closer, circling the younger customer like wolves trapping prey. The kid, a lanky teenager no older than 17, clutched his backpack tied to his chest. He looked like he was frozen in place, his mind racing for a way out, but his legs refusing to move. The shelves around him seemed to close in, and his face turned pale as the bikers loomed over him. Scarface's gravelly voice echoed through the gas station. "Come on, kid. You heard me. Show us what you've got in that bag." I told you," the boy stammered, his voice cracking. "I don't have anything." The wiry biker stepped in first, his movements quick and twitchy, like he couldn't stand still. His greasy hair flopped into his face as he grabbed at the backpack. "That's so? Then you won't mind if we take a look, right?" The kid flinched and took a step back, his sneakers squeaking on the tile. "Leave me alone." "Wrong answer." The stocky biker, thick arms, leather vest stretched across his barrel chest, shoved the kid hard. His back hit the shelves, and rows of chips and candy bars tumbled onto the floor. "Oops," the stocky one sneered, smirking at the mess. "Clumsy, aren't ya?" Scarface watched it all, standing just a few feet away with his arms crossed, looking like a king overseeing his subjects. "Listen, kid," he said, his tone mockingly gentle. "We're being real nice here. We're asking. You don't want to know what happens if we stop asking." A nervous gasp came from a customer standing near the coffee machines. It was a woman in her 40s, clutching her purse tightly, her eyes darting toward the door. She wasn't the only one. A man near the refrigerated drinks shifted nervously, pretending to examine a bottle of water, his hand shaking just slightly. Nobody wanted to look at what was happening. Nobody wanted to be next. Except John. Behind the counter, John sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding near the snack aisle. From anyone else's perspective, he still looked calm, almost uninterested, like this wasn't even worth his time. His old newspaper lay on the counter, forgotten now. But there was something in his eyes, something sharp and focused. He was watching. Waiting. Scarface, noticing the way customers started to squirm, seemed to enjoy himself even more. He let out a low, cruel laugh, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Man, look at this place," he sneered, turning toward his buddies. "All these people, and not one of them is gonna say a word." The wiry biker laughed along with him, grabbing the boy's backpack and yanking it hard. The boy held on, struggling, his face red with effort and frustration. "I said leave me alone," he shouted, his voice trembling. The stocky biker's expression darkened. He grabbed the kid's arm roughly. "You're not listening, punk. You don't get to say no to us." Another hard yank, and the boy stumbled forward. The wiry biker ripped the backpack away from him, sending it skidding across the tile floor. Zippers popped open, and its contents spilled everywhere, a couple of books, some crumpled papers, and a cheap wallet. Scarface's eyes lit up as he stepped closer, crouching down to pick up the wallet. He held it up between two fingers like it was something dirty, his scar twisting into a grin. "What do we have here?" "Please," the boy muttered, his voice barely audible now. "It's all I have." Scarface opened the wallet and flipped through it, pulling out a single $20 bill. Well, he said mockingly. "You were lying to us, kid. You do have something." The boy's fists clenched at his sides, tears welling up in his eyes. He looked helpless, trapped. The wiry biker pocketed the 20 and gave the wallet an exaggerated toss over his shoulder, like it was garbage. It landed near the shelves with a dull slap. Scarface straightened, turning back toward his buddies. See? That wasn't so hard. These kids just need a little encouragement. The bikers laughed, but it was an ugly sound, sharp and cruel. For the other customers, that was the moment they gave up. They didn't look. They didn't move. A heavy silence settled over the store, broken only by the hum of the lights overhead and the faint sound of someone nervously clearing their throat. John. John was still watching. Scarface turned toward the counter, catching sight of John sitting there. He tilted his head, his smile returning, but now there was a challenge in his eyes. "Hey, Pops," Scarface called out, his voice loud and mocking. "You just gonna sit there while we handle things for you? I mean, it's not your business, right?" John's eyes flicked up to meet Scarface's. For the first time, he spoke. "Doesn't look like you're handling much of anything," he said quietly. The words hung in the air. Scarface blinked, caught off guard for half a second. Then, slowly, his grin widened. He stepped toward the counter, his boots heavy on the tile. The other two bikers followed, like shadows at his back. The kid stood frozen in place, rubbing his arm where he'd been grabbed. His eyes darted to John, then back to the bikers, like he was hoping anyone would step in. Scarface leaned on the counter again, his scarred face just inches from John. "What'd you say, old man?" John didn't look away. His gaze was steady, calm, but there was something colder there now. Something dangerous. "I said, it doesn't look like you're handling much of anything." Scarface's grin faltered, just for a moment. He straightened, cracking his knuckles loudly, like he was trying to prove a point. "You've got a big mouth for a guy who doesn't want trouble." "I don't want trouble," John said simply, folding his newspaper. "But it seems like you're set on causing it." The wiry biker sneered, stepping up beside Scarface. "What's your deal, huh? You a tough guy or something?" John didn't answer. He just looked at them. The stocky biker crossed his thick arms, grinning like he'd just thought of something funny. "Maybe Pops here thinks he's a hero. Is that it, old man? You gonna save the day?" John's voice didn't rise. It stayed calm. Steady. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a guy who doesn't like bullies." Scarface's smile disappeared entirely now. The room felt colder. His buddies fell silent, watching him for their cue. Scarface stared at John, his dark eyes narrowing. "You've got a big mouth for someone who's outnumbered." John tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. "I've been outnumbered before." The words hit like a stone dropped in a still pond. The bikers didn't know what to make of it. Scarface's fists clenched, and he glanced back at his buddies as if silently telling them to get ready. John noticed the movement. He noticed everything. The way Scarface's breathing had quickened. The way the wiry biker kept shifting from foot to foot, his energy crackling like an overwound spring. The way the stocky one flexed his hands, ready to use his strength. John had seen men like this before. Plenty of times. Men who thought they were untouchable. Men who thought the world belonged to them just because they were loud, strong, and willing to hurt others to get their way. Bullies. Scarface turned his attention back to John, his voice low and cold. "Let me tell you something, old man. You don't know who you're messing with. We're not the kind of guys you say no to. You got that?" John didn't blink. "I hear you." Scarface smirked, but the look in his eyes was anything but friendly. "Good. Then you'll understand what happens next if you keep running your mouth." For the first time, John's expression shifted just slightly. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to understanding. "That's so," John said quietly, his voice almost thoughtful. Scarface grinned wider, misinterpreting the response as hesitation. Yeah, that's so. You keep your mouth shut, and you stay out of our way. Otherwise, he trailed off, letting the threat hang in the air. John stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We'll see. Scarface blinked, caught off guard again. What's that supposed to mean? John didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because something had changed. The room felt different now, like the storm that had been quietly building was just about to break. Scarface's brow furrowed, the smug grin on his face slipping just a little. He wasn't used to people talking back. Especially not an old man like John. For a moment, he seemed to weigh his options, like he was deciding whether or not to escalate things further. The gas station fell deathly quiet. The hum of the refrigerator cases in the back and the faint tick-tick of the clock above the counter were the only sounds left. The other customers froze, some sneaking nervous glances toward the bikers and others keeping their eyes firmly planted on the floor. John didn't move. He didn't flinch. Maybe you didn't hear me, Scarface said, his voice colder now. He leaned closer, his scarred face just inches from John's, the sharp stench of cigarettes and motor oil clinging to him. I told you to keep your mouth shut. You do want to stay in one piece, don't you, Pops? John met his stare head on, his weathered face completely calm. I hear you just fine, he replied evenly, the faintest edge in his voice now. But you're making a mistake. Scarface straightened, cracking his knuckles loudly again, trying to intimidate him. A mistake, he echoed mockingly. What mistake's that, huh? John folded his hands on the counter and said nothing for a beat. His gaze didn't waver. Finally, his voice came low and steady, pushing me. The wiry biker let out a bark of laughter. You hear this guy? Thinks he's Clint Eastwood or something. The stocky one laughed too, his deep, rumbling voice breaking the tension like a hammer on glass. Yeah, we're shaking in our boots, Pops. Better sit back down and keep counting pennies. Scarface didn't laugh, though. His dark eyes stayed locked on John, as if he sensed on some instinctive level that something was off. He'd spent years intimidating people into silence. He knew how fear looked. The way hands shook. The way voices faltered. The way eyes darted away. But John wasn't afraid. And that made Scarface uneasy. The biker leader took a step back, but not out of surrender, just to size John up. You think you're tough, huh, old man, he muttered, his tone dropping to a dangerous growl. John tilted his head slightly, the calm in his eyes unwavering. Tough enough, he replied. Scarface's face twisted into a snarl. He didn't like being challenged. Didn't like the fact that someone he'd written off as just another old man wasn't cowering the way he expected. Big talk, Scarface hissed, his voice dripping with venom. Maybe we need to remind you of your place. The wiry biker stepped forward, eager to prove himself. His hands twitched at his sides, and his lips curled into a sneer. I'll handle this, he said, looking back at Scarface for approval. Scarface gave a nod, the corner of his mouth lifting in an ugly smirk. The wiry biker turned toward John, his movements sharp and jittery, like he couldn't wait to start trouble. He sauntered up to the counter, slapping his hands down on the surface with a loud thud. How about you get off your high horse, Gramps, he sneered, leaning forward. You think you're better than us or something? John didn't move. He didn't so much as blink. Answer me, the wiry biker snapped, his voice rising. He slapped the counter again, harder this time. Still, John didn't react. He just stared, unshaken. The wiry biker's face darkened. Losing patience, he reached across the counter, his fingers brushing John's shirt collar. Maybe you need a... Before he could finish the sentence, John's hand shot out, faster than anyone in the room could follow. His weathered fingers wrapped around the biker's wrist with a vice-like grip. The wiry biker froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in surprise. "Hey, what the hell?" John's voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the edge this time. "Let go," he said simply, squeezing the man's wrist just enough to make him wince. The biker yanked his arm back, stumbling slightly as he freed himself. His face went red with anger and embarrassment. "You're gonna regret that, old man," he spat, pointing an accusing finger at John. Scarface's expression darkened further as he watched his buddy retreat like a scolded dog. "You're asking for it now," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. The stocky biker stepped forward next, cracking his knuckles with a sound like breaking branches. "Looks like Pops wants to play rough," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "Let's teach him some manners." For the first time, John straightened to his full height behind the counter. He wasn't a tall man, but something about the way he moved slow and deliberate made him look bigger. "Stronger. Teaching me manners," John repeated softly, shaking his head. "That's rich, coming from you." The stocky biker bristled, his face darkening. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," John replied evenly. "All right, that's it." The stocky biker's patience snapped, and he charged toward the counter, his boots thudding loudly against the floor. But John was ready. In one smooth motion, John stepped sideways just as the biker lunged forward, letting the man's momentum carry him too far. The biker's chest collided with the edge of the counter, knocking the wind out of him with a loud oof. John didn't stop there. While the stocky biker gasped for breath, John grabbed a nearby bottle of water from the cooler behind him and twisted it open. Before anyone could process what was happening, he dumped the water straight over the biker's head. The stocky biker sputtered, flailing in shock as ice-cold water drenched his face and shirt. "What the hell?" he bellowed, his voice muffled as he swiped at his eyes. The wiry biker stared at the scene, stunned. Even Scarface blinked, caught off guard by how quickly the situation had flipped. John, however, stood completely still, calm as ever. He replaced the empty bottle on the counter with a small, satisfied smile. "Cool off," he said simply. The customers who had been holding their breath suddenly exhaled, a couple of them stifling nervous laughter. The woman near the coffee machines covered her mouth, her wide eyes darting between John and the bikers. Scarface's face turned red with anger, his scar twisting as his jaw clenched tight. "You've got no idea who you're messing with, old man," he growled, his voice a low threat. "You think this is funny?" John shrugged, unbothered. "A little. That did it?" Scarface slammed his fist on the counter, making the items near the register rattle. "That's it," he roared. "You want to act tough? Fine. Let's see how tough you really are." He nodded to the other bikers, and they moved in together this time. The wiry biker recovered quickly, still rubbing his wrist where John had grabbed him. "We're gonna teach you some respect, Pops," he spat, his voice trembling with anger. The stocky one, still dripping wet, flexed his massive arms. "You're dead," he snarled. "But John?" John just rolled up his sleeves. It was a slow, deliberate movement, one that told everyone in the room that he wasn't backing down. The scars on his forearms were faint but unmistakable. Old wounds. Stories left untold. Stories that said this wasn't his first time staring down men who thought they were untouchable. The bikers didn't notice, though. They were too blinded by anger. Scarface smirked, gesturing to his buddies to move in. "Take him." The stocky biker charged again, his heavy boots pounding against the floor. The wiry one followed close behind, his hands twitching, ready to grab hold of John. Scarface stayed back, watching like a puppet master. He was certain this was over. To him, John was just an old man out of his depth. He couldn't have been more wrong. John didn't move until the last possible second. In one swift motion, he ducked under the stocky biker's swing, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it sharply. The biker let out a yell of pain as John slammed him face first into the counter with a loud thud. The wiry biker, caught off guard by the speed of it all, hesitated just a fraction too long. It was all John needed. He spun to face him, stepping forward and grabbing the front of his leather jacket. With a sudden yank, John pulled the wiry biker forward and sent him sprawling to the ground. Scarface's smirk disappeared completely. He watched, stunned, as both of his men groaned in pain. One was slumped against the counter, clutching his arm. The other lay sprawled out on the tile, dazed and disoriented. And John? John stood tall, his expression calm, unbothered. Like this was just another Tuesday. Scarface's hand twitched at his side, his jaw clenched tight. "What the hell are you?" he muttered under his breath. John's eyes met his, cold and steady. "Someone you shouldn't have messed with." Scarface's confidence flickered, but he wasn't one to back down, especially not in front of his crew. The wiry biker was back on his feet now, still rubbing his wrist where John had grabbed him earlier. He looked furious and humiliated. The stocky one, face flushed, shirt-soaked, growled low under his breath, glaring daggers at John. "You think you're some kind of tough guy, huh?" Scarface barked, trying to recover his swagger. He squared his shoulders, stepping forward like a predator trying to corner its prey. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." John didn't flinch. If anything, his calm grew more unsettling. It wasn't arrogance, nor was it anger, it was the quiet confidence of someone who had walked through storms and come out the other side unshaken. 3 seconds, John repeated softly. Scarface scoffed, turning to his crew with an exaggerated roll of his eyes. "You believe this guy?" He gestured toward John like he was a punchline. "He's trying to give us an ultimatum. This old fool has no idea who he's dealing with." John's eyes didn't waver. He began to count. 1. Scarface's smirk faltered, just a fraction. The tension in the room was palpable now, thick as smoke. The other customers, some clutching bags of chips or half-filled coffee cups, had backed as far away as they could. They looked at John and Scarface like they were watching a powder keg about to explode. 2, John said, his voice steady, even. The stocky biker cracked his knuckles again, louder this time, like a threat. "This guy's lost his mind." Scarface grinned wickedly, masking whatever unease might have been creeping in. 3. What happens at 3, Pops? John's expression was ice. "You don't want to find out?" For a moment, Scarface hesitated. Something about the way John said it made it sound less like a bluff and more like a fact. The kind of fact you didn't question. But Scarface wasn't a man who backed down easily. Especially not when he had an audience. "You know what?" Scarface snarled. "I'm sick of this old man running his mouth." He motioned to his stocky buddy, who didn't need more encouragement. The big man charged toward John like a bull, his massive frame barreling forward, fists clenched. The customers gasped, a couple of them flinching away like they couldn't bear to see what would happen next. John, however, didn't move. He didn't back away, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Then, in one sudden, fluid motion faster than anyone expected, John stepped aside at the last second. The stocky biker's momentum carried him forward, too far, too fast. Crash! The big man slammed shoulder first into a rack of snacks. Bags of chips and candy bars scattered like confetti as the shelf tilted and toppled, sending him sprawling on the ground in a pile of junk food. John didn't pause. Before the stocky man could recover, John grabbed the back of his jacket, yanked him up just enough to spin him around, and shoved him back down face first, this time against the tile floor. The thud echoed like a drum beat in the silent room. The wiry biker froze mid-step, his jaw hanging open. What the? Scarface's grin had vanished completely. His dark eyes narrowed, his scar twisting as his lips pulled into a scowl. Get him, he barked. The wiry biker hesitated, but Scarface's order was clear. He lunged toward John, swinging wildly. This one wasn't like the stocky brute, he was faster, wiry, unpredictable. But John was calm, methodical, his movements deliberate. The wiry biker's punch whipped through empty air. Before he could swing again, John grabbed his arm and spun him in a quick, controlled circle. The momentum threw the wiry biker off balance, and John guided him straight into the counter. The sharp edge caught him in the ribs, and he let out a strangled groan as he crumpled to the floor. Scarface's jaw clenched tight. He hadn't moved from his spot near the center of the room, his fists flexing at his sides. For the first time, a bead of sweat ran down his temple. The other customers were frozen in awe. Nobody could believe what they were seeing. Just minutes ago, John Wallace was just another old man. Now, he moved with the precision and confidence of someone far more dangerous. Scarface pointed a trembling finger at John, trying to regain control of the situation. Who are you, huh? Some kind of ex-boxer? You're lucky we're not. I'm not lucky, John interrupted. His voice was low, but it cut through the room like a knife. Scarface blinked, startled. John stepped closer, his gaze locked onto Scarface like a predator zeroing in on prey. You want to know who I am? He asked quietly. He wasn't shouting, wasn't sneering. That calm, measured tone was far more unnerving. I'm the guy who spent 30 years putting men like you behind bars. The words hung in the air like smoke, sinking in slow. Scarface's face paled slightly, but he tried to cover it up. What the hell's that supposed to mean? I used to be a cop, John said plainly. His voice didn't carry a shred of arrogance, just cold, hard truth. Narcotics. Gangs. Organized crime. I've seen your type 1,000 times. The bullies who think nobody's going to stand up to them. Scarface's sneer faltered again. He looked at the wiry biker still groaning on the floor. He glanced at the stocky one, who hadn't managed to sit up yet. His gang was supposed to be invincible, feared. But this man, this old gas station clerk, had taken them apart like it was nothing. You're lying, Scarface spat, his voice shaking ever so slightly. You're just trying to scare us. John shrugged. You think so? The clock on the wall ticked loudly, every second feeling stretched longer than it should. One of the customers, a middle-aged man in a flannel jacket, whispered under his breath, "Holy crap, he's serious." Scarface heard it. His eyes darted toward the customer, then back to John. I don't care if you're a cop or a damn superhero, Scarface growled. You just made the biggest mistake of your life messing with us. John tilted his head, unconcerned. That's so. You think you're tough now, huh? Scarface's voice cracked as he pointed a shaky finger at John. You have no idea who we are. You think this is over? You just wait, old man. You're dead. You hear me? You're dead. John didn't blink. You've got a loud mouth, he said quietly. But loud mouths are easy to deal with. Scarface's bravado flickered like a dying light bulb. His mind was racing now, trying to figure out how the situation had spiraled so far out of control. His crew, the same guys he relied on to intimidate and bully anyone they pleased, were out cold or too hurt to fight back. And this old man? He wasn't afraid. Not one bit. John reached into his back pocket, slowly and deliberately. Scarface flinched, half expecting a weapon, but what John pulled out wasn't a gun or a knife. It was a wallet. He opened it, and there, clear as day, was an old, worn badge. It wasn't shiny and new anymore, but it didn't need to be. It told the story. Scarface's face went slack. He took a step back. "Retired," John said simply, flipping the wallet shut and sliding it back into his pocket. "But that doesn't mean I've forgotten how to handle trouble." For the first time, Scarface looked truly unsure. He glanced around the room, his gaze darting to his fallen crew and then to the other customers, who were now openly staring at him with disbelief. John took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "I gave you a chance to leave quietly. You didn't take it? So now, you'll deal with me." Scarface opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. He stumbled back another step, his bravado in tatters. John didn't smile. Didn't gloat. He just stood there, his calm as steady as ever. "What's it going to be?" he asked. Scarface swallowed hard. His face twisted in anger, frustration, and something else, fear. Without another word, he turned toward the door. He yanked it open, the bells above it jangling loudly, and stormed out into the parking lot. The wiry biker scrambled to his feet, clutching his ribs as he followed Scarface out. The stocky one groaned but managed to stumble after them, still dazed. The customers remained frozen, staring at the door as it swung shut behind the bikers. Silence filled the store. John took a deep breath, then turned and calmly walked back behind the counter. He picked up his newspaper and sat down like nothing had happened. Are you okay?" a young woman finally stammered, her voice trembling. John glanced up and smiled faintly. "Never better." Nobody said a word for a long time. But in their eyes, John was no longer just the old guy at the register. He was something else entirely. The biker's exit left a vacuum in the room. For a moment, it was as though time itself had paused. The customers stared at John, some in awe, others in shock, as if they were trying to process what they just witnessed. John, for his part, picked up his newspaper again with the calm nonchalance of a man who had simply swatted a few flies. The bell above the door jingled softly as it settled, but the sound couldn't erase the tension lingering in the air. A young man in a hoodie, who'd been frozen near the coffee machine, finally broke the silence. Are they coming back?" he asked, his voice quivering slightly. John glanced up from the sports section, his expression unreadable. "Maybe." The young man paled. "Shouldn't you call someone? Like the police?" John's eyes lingered on him for a moment before he answered, his tone measured. "Not yet." "Not yet," another voice piped up, this time from a middle-aged woman holding a small carton of milk. "What do you mean not yet? Those men were dangerous." John set his newspaper down again and leaned back slightly in his chair, his weathered hands resting on the counter. He looked at the woman calm and steady as though he had all the time in the world. "They're trying to prove a point," he said. "If they come back, they'll come back angry, looking to settle a score. And when they do, we'll deal with it." "We," she repeated, clearly unsettled. John smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'll deal with it?" The woman frowned, shaking her head, but she didn't argue. Most of the other customers were already gathering their things in a hurry, sneaking glances at the parking lot as if expecting the bikers to storm back through the door any second. The flannel-clad man, one of the few who had spoken earlier, approached the counter cautiously. "You really a cop, mister?" "Was," John corrected. "Retired." The man scratched his chin, clearly impressed. "Huh. Well, I'll be damned. You don't see that every day." John simply nodded, picking up his coffee and taking a slow sip. One by one, the customers trickled out of the store, eager to get out before trouble came back. A few muttered quick words of thanks as they left, their voices hushed as if afraid to attract the wrong kind of attention. Soon, the store was empty again. The hum of the overhead fluorescent lights was the only sound filling the space. John sat behind the counter, staring out through the window at the parking lot, his expression unreadable. Outside, the parking lot stretched under the mid-morning sun. John watched it quietly, his eyes scanning the space with the care of someone who'd learned to notice everything. A car pulled in, a beat-up sedan driven by an older man who didn't seem to have a clue what had just unfolded inside the store. John took another sip of coffee, his movements slow and deliberate. The quiet wouldn't last. He knew that. Men like Scarface didn't let things go. They always came back. The hours ticked by slowly. A few customers drifted in and out, locals grabbing coffee, truck drivers picking up snacks for the road, but the morning rush had mostly come and gone. Outside, the sky had shifted to a cloudless blue, the sun rising higher as noon approached. John spent the time in quiet routine, wiping down the counter, restocking cigarettes, and brewing a fresh pot of coffee. To anyone watching, he seemed like just another employee passing the time on a slow shift. But behind the calm facade, his mind was working, always working. He replayed every moment of the earlier encounter, analyzing it like a chess game. Scarface was no ordinary bully. He had a leader's presence, the kind of man who drew followers through intimidation and reckless charm. The scar on his face wasn't just for show. John knew men like him, men who thrived on violence because it made them feel powerful. John also knew men like that hated one thing more than anything else: losing control. Scarface had lost control back in the store. John had humiliated him, made him look weak in front of his crew. That wasn't the kind of insult a man like Scarface let slide. It wasn't a question of if he'd return. It was a question of when. At 12:30, the answer came. The deep, guttural rumble of motorcycle engines echoed through the parking lot like a thunderstorm rolling in. John didn't look up right away. He kept his focus on the register, calmly counting the cash drawer like he hadn't noticed a thing. The rumble grew louder, closer. Through the glass doors, shadows passed over the pavement as the bikes rolled in. There were more of them this time, at least 6, maybe 7, each one louder and meaner looking than the last. John's jaw tightened, but his face remained calm. He finished counting the money, closed the drawer, and picked up his coffee. He took a slow sip as the engines cut off, leaving a heavy silence in their place. The glass door swung open, and Scarface stepped inside. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 of the bikers from earlier flanked him, the wiry one with a bruise blooming across his ribs and the stocky brute still moving stiffly from his collision with the snack rack. Behind them were 4 others, bigger, meaner, and clearly not there to buy drinks. Scarface's face twisted into a cruel smile as he locked eyes with John. "Miss me, Pops?" John set his coffee cup down and looked up. "Didn't expect you back so soon." Scarface chuckled, though the sound held no humor. "Couldn't leave unfinished business." He glanced around the store, his dark eyes sweeping over the empty aisles. "Looks like your customers didn't want to stick around. Wonder why?" John didn't answer. Scarface stepped closer to the counter, his boots echoing against the tile. "You made a big mistake earlier," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Nobody embarrasses me and gets away with it." John tilted his head slightly. "Embarrassed yourself," he replied. The wiry biker sneered. "You got a death wish, old man." John's gaze shifted to him, his expression flat. "No. Do you?" The wiry biker took a step forward, fists clenched, but Scarface held up a hand to stop him. "Not yet," Scarface growled. He leaned on the counter, his face inches from John's. "Here's how this is gonna work, Pops. You're gonna apologize. Right here, right now. You're gonna beg for our forgiveness." John met his gaze without blinking. "No." Scarface's smile vanished. He straightened up, his jaw tightening as his hands curled into fists. "I was hoping you'd say that." The stocky biker took a step forward, cracking his knuckles again, but John was already moving. Before anyone could react, John grabbed the heavy glass coffee pot from its burner and flung it. The pot exploded against the stocky biker's chest, sending a wave of scalding hot coffee spilling over him. He screamed, staggering back as steam rose from his shirt. Chaos erupted. The wiry biker lunged across the counter, but John ducked under his swinging arm and grabbed a fire extinguisher from beneath the register. With a practiced motion, he swung the canister upward, catching the wiry man under the chin with a metallic clang. The biker crumpled to the floor in a heap. Scarface roared in fury. "Get him!" The other bikers charged forward, but John was already moving again. He yanked the fire extinguisher's pin and sprayed a thick cloud of white foam into the faces of the two closest bikers. They coughed and stumbled blindly, their hands clawing at the mist. John didn't stop. He dropped the extinguisher and grabbed a broom leaning nearby. With swift, powerful strikes, he took out the legs of one biker, sending him sprawling to the floor. Another reached for John, but John rammed the broom handle into his stomach, knocking the air from his lungs. Scarface stood at the center of the chaos, his face red with rage. He pulled a switchblade from his pocket, the blade snapping open with a menacing click. John turned to face him, breathing hard but steady. "You really want to do this?" Scarface's lip curled. "I'm gonna gut you, old man." He charged. John sidestepped at the last second, grabbing Scarface's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground. Scarface howled in pain, but John didn't let go. He spun him around and shoved him face first against the counter. "Stay down," John growled. Scarface struggled for a moment, but John applied just enough pressure to make him stop. The remaining bikers groaned on the floor, too battered to fight back. The store was silent again. John released Scarface, who collapsed to his knees, panting heavily. John stepped back, surveying the wreckage. Shelves were knocked over, foam covered the floor, and battered bikers lay sprawled in every direction. John picked up the switchblade from the ground, closed it, and slid it across the counter. "Get out," he said calmly. Scarface stared up at him, pure hatred in his eyes. But he knew better than to argue. He staggered to his feet and stumbled toward the door, motioning for the others to follow. One by one, they limped out of the store, leaving behind the chaos they had brought with them. The bell jingled softly as the door swung shut. John exhaled, picked up his coffee cup, and muttered, "I'm going to need a new pot." The store seemed to shrink around them, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Scarface's groan echoed off the walls as he writhed on the floor, clutching his knee. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced with disbelief and something closer to fear. The second biker, still sprawled near the candy rack, tried to crawl backward, his eyes wide as saucers. You're lying. There's no way. You're just some old man." John turned slowly, the baton resting casually against his shoulder. There was no hint of anger on his face, just that calm, steady presence. "You think so?" The third biker, a wiry man with a mop of greasy hair, was still at the door, shaking the lock with panicked hands. "It's jammed." "It's what the—" John hadn't jammed it. The lock was fine. It was just that in their frantic desperation, they couldn't think straight. And that's what fear did, it clouded the mind, made even the simple seem impossible. Scarface sat up slightly, breathing hard, his face twisted in rage. "You're dead, old man. You don't know who you're messing with." John tilted his head just a little. "No. You don't know who you're messing with." He stepped closer, the steel baton in his hand still at the ready. Scarface's eyes followed it like it was a snake poised to strike. "You walk into a place like this," John said, his voice even and cold, "and think you own it. You think people are just going to look away, keep their heads down, let you do what you want." He stopped just in front of Scarface, looming over him. "Most of the time, you're right. But every now and then, John crouched slightly so they were eye to eye. You walk into the wrong store. Scarface flinched, but his bravado wasn't entirely gone. You think you're tough, huh? He spat. You don't know who I am. You don't know what we can do to you. John's mouth twitched just a hint of a smile. You talk too much. And with that, he stood up straight and turned his attention to the remaining bikers. Any of you want to make a move? He asked, scanning the room with eyes that seemed to see right through them. The wiry biker let go of the door, his hands raised slightly. We don't want any trouble, man. Just let us out, all right. John stared at him for a long moment, then nodded toward the door. Try again. Calmly, this time. The wiry man stumbled toward the lock, his hands shaking slightly. This time, he turned the knob, and the lock clicked open easily. He stared at it like it was a magic trick before bolting outside, the glass door slamming shut behind him. Scarface growled from the floor, struggling to stand. You think this is over? He hissed through clenched teeth. John looked down at him. Oh, it's over. Scarface glared up at him, pure hatred burning in his eyes. You're dead. You don't get it? We're part of something bigger than you, bigger than this stupid store. John didn't flinch. I've heard that before. He reached behind the counter and pulled out an old, battered flip phone. The bikers still standing exchanged nervous glances as John flipped it open and dialed a number with slow, deliberate keystrokes. Who are you calling? Scarface spat. John ignored him, holding the phone to his ear. Yeah, it's Wallace, he said calmly. You're gonna want to get a car down to Mike's gas station on Route 9. We've got a situation. A pause. Yeah, they're still here. Don't worry, they're not going anywhere. Scarface's face paled slightly. Who's Wallace? Who are you? John closed the phone with a sharp snap. Retired Sergeant John Wallace, NYPD. Badge 2417. The bikers froze. The letters NYPD hung in the air like a lead weight. Scarface's eyes darted to his crew. He's bluffing. He's got to be bluffing. John leaned against the counter, the baton still in his hand, though he seemed perfectly at ease. You boys think you're scary. But you haven't met Scary yet. He gestured casually towards Scarface's crew. You see, I spent 25 years on the job. I've dealt with men far worse than you gang leaders, dealers, stick-up crews. You name it, I've seen it. And you all. He paused, letting the silence settle. You're just kids playing dress-up. The bikers exchanged uneasy looks. The room had shifted again, this time entirely in John's favor. Scarface sneered, though his confidence was cracking. Big talk. You think the cops are gonna save you? By the time they get here, you'll... They'll be here in 5 minutes, John interrupted coolly. That's all the time you've got to decide how you want this to go down. You can walk out that door and take your chances with whatever's waiting for you outside. He paused and pointed the baton at Scarface. Or you can stick around, and we'll finish this conversation. Scarface's lip curled. You're bluffing. John shrugged. Try me. The seconds stretched, thick with tension. The other bikers shuffled nervously, clearly waiting for Scarface to decide what to do. One of them, the stocky one who was still wiping foam off his face, spoke up. Man. Let's just go. Scarface shot him a venomous glare. Shut up. But his voice had lost some of its bite. The cracks were showing now. The fight they'd brought with them was draining out, replaced with something closer to uncertainty. John pushed off the counter, stepping closer. Scarface flinched slightly as John loomed over him again. You've got 2 choices, John said softly. Make the right one. For the first time, Scarface didn't have a snappy retort. He glanced at the door, then back at his crew. They were already inching toward the exit, their confidence shattered. Finally, with a low growl, Scarface got to his feet, his movements stiff from the earlier blow to his knee. "You're lucky," he spat. "Real lucky." John didn't say a word. He just watched as Scarface limped toward the door, his crew trailing behind him like lost dogs. The glass door swung shut behind them, the bell chiming softly as they disappeared into the parking lot. John waited a moment, listening to the rumble of the motorcycles as they sputtered to life and tore out of the parking lot, their engines roaring like wounded animals. He didn't move until the sound had faded into the distance, leaving behind only the hum of the overhead lights. The store was a mess. Shelves had been knocked over, snacks littered the floor, and the scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air. John sighed and set the baton on the counter. From outside, a pair of black and white police cruisers pulled into the lot, their red and blue lights flashing faintly. John watched them through the window, his face calm and unreadable. The glass door opened, and a young officer stepped inside, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. What happened here?" John picked up his coffee cup now cold and took a sip. "Had a little trouble earlier." The officer stared at him. "Trouble? Sir, this looks like a war zone." John shrugged, setting the cup down. "Could have been worse." Another officer stepped inside, a woman with sharp eyes and a confident stride. She glanced at John and smiled faintly. "You holding up, Sergeant?" John smiled back. "Always." She nodded. "We'll take it from here. You might want to sit down for a bit." John leaned back against the counter, his hands resting on the edge. "I'll be fine. Cleanup's on me, though." The officer chuckled softly before signaling to her team. As they began their investigation, John turned his attention back to the window. The parking lot was empty now, peaceful, quiet. John allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "Wrong store," he muttered under his breath. And with that, he reached for a mop and bucket, ready to clean up the mess. Just another day at Mike's gas station. The officers moved through the store, talking in low voices as they surveyed the damage. Flashlights flickered over broken shelves, scattered candy, and upturned displays. John stayed where he was, his posture relaxed but his gaze watchful. He didn't miss a thing. "Sergeant Wallace," the female officer called, approaching him with a faint grin. "Didn't expect to see you back in action today." John raised a brow. "Wasn't exactly by choice." She chuckled, though her eyes flickered with a quiet admiration. "You still got it? You scared those guys out of here so fast, we passed them a few miles down Route 9. She shook her head. "One of them was limping pretty bad." "You didn't." John let out a small sigh. "I gave them options. They chose poorly." The young officer nearby, a rookie, barely in his 20s, looked at John with wide eyes. "Wait, you did this?" He pointed to the chaos in the store. "No offense, sir, but aren't you, old?" John finished, his tone dry. The rookie turned beet red. "I didn't mean John cracked a faint smile, putting him out. Minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights from the squad cars illuminated the gas station parking lot. The sirens screamed their urgent call as the officers moved in, their boots pounding against the cracked pavement. John stood just inside the door, watching as the bikers were cuffed one by one. Scarface's face was twisted in fury, his eyes burning with resentment as he was roughly led away. "You think you're a hero?" Scarface growled, his voice thick with anger. John didn't flinch. He just looked at the man calmly, the weight of his years in the force still carrying through in his stance. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Just doing what needed to be done." Scarface's glare burned even harder, but it didn't faze John. The bikers were no longer a threat. They were simply criminals being processed, no longer the kings they had once thought they were. The law had arrived, and it would take care of the rest. As the police officers dragged Scarface and the others out of the store, a small figure emerged from the corner of the store. It was the young customer, the one who had been caught in the middle of it all. His hands were still trembling, his eyes wide and filled with both fear and relief. He slowly walked up to John, his steps hesitant, unsure of how to thank the man who had saved him from being hurt. "Thank you," the boy mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. John looked up from the register, giving him a small, reassuring smile. His face was as calm as ever, the quiet strength in his eyes unmistakable. "Go on, kid. You're safe now. Get out of here. No need to thank me." The boy nodded quickly, almost as though he didn't believe what had just happened. He didn't hesitate for a second before he turned and fled the store, a small sense of peace replacing the fear that had been in his eyes earlier. With the situation handled, the gas station fell back into its quiet routine. The sirens faded into the distance, leaving only the hum of the fluorescent lights above. The officers finished up their paperwork and gave John a brief nod before they made their way to their patrol cars, ready to take the bikers down to the station for processing. As the last of the officers left, the door closed softly behind them. The place seemed empty now, as though the storm had passed, and everything was normal again. John, however, didn't feel the need to relax just yet. He wasn't one to let his guard down easily. Not after everything he had been through. But as he sat back down behind the counter, he picked up his newspaper again, as though nothing had happened. The chaos from just moments before seemed to melt away in the calm aftermath. The store, which had once been the site of a violent confrontation, was now peaceful again. The shelves were a mess, snacks and candy scattered across the floor, and a few toppled bottles of soda. But the most important thing was that the threat was gone. The bikers were in custody, the kid was safe, and John had done what he had to do. He wasn't looking for recognition or thanks. He never had been. He had done his job, just like he had done countless times before, and that was enough for him. As John picked up his cup of coffee again and took a sip, the door opened with a soft chime. He didn't even look up at first. Just another customer, he thought. But then he heard the voice, and it wasn't one he recognized. "Hey, John." John's eyes lifted slowly, and he saw the familiar face of a local sheriff, one he had worked with in the past. The sheriff was still young, but he carried the confidence of someone who had seen his fair share of difficult situations. "You need a hand cleaning up?" the sheriff asked, a friendly smile on his face. John nodded, placing the cup down on the counter. "Nah, it's all good. I've got it. But thanks." The sheriff leaned against the counter, watching John for a moment. "You know, word's going to get around about what happened here. People are going to talk." John raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think they'll say?" The sheriff chuckled. "Oh, they'll say you're a hero, sure. But I know you don't care about that. You never did." John let out a quiet laugh, the sound rough but genuine. "Nah. Heroes don't usually get paid." The sheriff gave him a knowing look, his smile fading just a bit. "Well, if you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask. You've done more than enough for this town." John nodded, his face softening just a little. "Thanks. I appreciate it." The sheriff stayed for a moment longer, watching John as he started to straighten the shelves and pick up the mess. He knew better than to try and offer more praise. John wasn't the type to accept it. He never had been. He had always preferred to let his actions speak for themselves. After a few moments, the sheriff gave a small nod and walked out the door, leaving John alone in the store once more. John didn't mind the silence. It was a familiar comfort. And besides, he wasn't alone. Not really. As long as he had a purpose, something to protect, something to care about. He didn't need much else. The gas station was quiet again, just like it always was on a normal Tuesday morning. Only now, there was something different about it. A quiet respect that lingered in the air. The bikers had been taken away, their threats silenced. The young kid who had been bullied had left with his head held high, his steps lighter than before. And John? He was back behind the counter, reading his paper like nothing had changed. But deep down, he knew it had. He had faced the worst of it and come out on top, just like he always had. In the end, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about doing what needed to be done, no matter how much it might cost. John Wallace wasn't a man who sought attention. But there were some things that had to be done, and for that, he was willing to stand up, no matter who was watching. The mess would be cleaned up. The bikers would face the consequences of their actions. And the town would continue, as it always had. But now, it would have a little more respect for the quiet old man behind the counter, the one who had stood his ground when no one else would. And for John, that was enough. The bell above the door rang softly as a new customer stepped inside, unaware of the story that had just unfolded in the small, quiet gas station. John didn't look up. He simply nodded in their direction, a small, satisfied smile on his face as he returned to his paper. Another day. Another job well done. And everything, for now, was right with the world. Sometimes, the toughest people are the ones you overlook. The ones who stay in the background, just watching, observing the world around them without causing a stir. The quiet ones, the ones who don't boast, who don't need to prove anything to anyone. They're often dismissed, ignored, or even underestimated. But what most people don't realize is that these are the people who hold the most strength. They don't need the spotlight. They don't seek attention. And when the time comes, they show just how much they're capable of without ever needing to say a word. John Wallace was one of those people. To the outside world, he was just another old man running a gas station. He was quiet, maybe a little gruff, and often overlooked by people who didn't know any better. He didn't stand out in a crowd, didn't try to make himself noticed. But John didn't need to. He knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. He had lived a life full of challenges, hard decisions, and moments where he had to stand up when no one else would. And in that quiet, unassuming way, he had learned something that most people would never understand. It wasn't about the glory. It wasn't about being praised or admired. It was about doing what was right when the situation called for it. It was about stepping up, even when you were the last person anyone expected to do so. It was about having the strength to stand firm, even if the odds were stacked against you. And it was about protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves, even if it meant making sacrifices along the way. For John, the decision to face down the bikers wasn't a difficult one. He didn't hesitate when the moment came. He had been a cop for years, and in that time, he had learned to read people, to assess threats, to know when to act and when to stay calm. The bikers had made the mistake of thinking he was just an old man behind a counter, someone they could push around. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. But when the moment arrived, John didn't just meet their challenge, he stopped them cold, swiftly and decisively. When it was all over, when the bikers were hauled away in handcuffs and the store was left in peace, John didn't want the thanks or the praise. He didn't need it. The only thing that mattered was that the people who had been in the store that day were safe. The young man who had been threatened had walked out of the gas station with a little more confidence in his step, knowing that someone had stood up for him. And the others, the ones who had watched in silence, would walk away with a little more respect for the quiet ones, for the ones who don't need to prove anything until it's absolutely necessary. John didn't need to be a hero. In fact, he didn't even want to be one. All he wanted was to make sure that when trouble came knocking, he would be ready to handle it. And he would do so in his own way, quietly, decisively, without drama or fanfare. That was enough for him. But the truth is, not everyone has that kind of inner strength. Not everyone has the ability to stay calm when things get rough, to act without hesitation when someone else might panic. It takes a certain kind of person to do what John did. It takes years of experience, a steady hand, and the kind of mental toughness that comes from knowing you've faced worse and come out the other side. And though John didn't need recognition, those who witnessed his actions that day would never forget it. They would remember the quiet man behind the counter who had taken a stand when no one else would. They would remember the lesson he taught them without ever saying a word, that sometimes, the strongest people are the ones you least expect. The world often celebrates the loud and the flashy. It rewards the ones who make a big scene, who seek attention, who stand out from the crowd. But there's another kind of strength, one that is often overlooked. It's the strength of the silent ones, the ones who observe, who understand, and who act when it's needed most. These are the ones who don't need to boast about their abilities because their actions speak for themselves. In life, we often focus on the people who make the most noise, who demand the most attention. But in reality, it's the quiet ones who often have the greatest impact. They're the ones who, when push comes to shove, know exactly what to do. They're the ones who quietly carry the weight of the world on their shoulders, never asking for help, never looking for praise. They do what needs to be done, even when no one is watching. It's easy to dismiss the quiet ones, to assume they have nothing to offer. But those who do are making a dangerous mistake. Because the quiet ones like John Wallace are the ones who carry the strength of experience, the wisdom of time, and the courage to stand up when others won't. And when it matters most, they'll be the ones who make the difference. Respect the quiet ones. You never know what they're capable of. That's the lesson John Wallace left behind in that small, quiet gas station on Route 9. It wasn't a lesson that came with fireworks or grand speeches. It was a lesson learned in the silence between actions, in the calm before the storm, in the simple choice to do what was right, no matter who was watching. So the next time you find yourself crossing paths with someone who seems unassuming, someone who doesn't seek attention, remember this: they may be the one who's quietly watching, waiting, and when the moment comes, they'll be the one who stands up, who makes the difference. And you'll be glad you didn't overlook them. Because sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who never let the world see what they're capable of until the time comes, and they do. And that's the kind of person you want on your side.